The woods were too quiet that day. Florida, 1988. A hunter pushes through the thick brush of Lake County, the August sun beating down on his back. He's not expecting to find anything unusual, just the rustle of wildlife, the stillness of the swampy air. But then he sees it, a shape, a body. What's left of a young woman lies hidden beneath leaves and branches. No identification, no personal belongings, nothing that could tell detectives who she was, or why her life had been cut short in such a brutal way. In that moment, one thing became clear. She had been murdered, but everything else was a mystery. Investigators gave her a name, not her real name, but one that would mark her case for decades: Julie Doe. For 37 long years, she was a ghost in the files of Florida's cold cases. No family came forward. No missing person matched her face. No answers ever surfaced. And so her story sat in silence, tucked away in the shadows of time. But silence has a way of breaking. In 2025, forensic genealogy finally cracked the code of her DNA. At last, Julie Doe was given back her true name, Pamela Leigh Walton. And yet, with the truth of who she was came another, darker truth. Her killer is still out there. This story isn't just about a murder. It's about identity stolen twice, once by death and again by anonymity. It's about how society failed to see her, how technology brought her back, and how justice continues to slip away. Because even with her name restored, the most haunting question remains unanswered. Who murdered Pamela Leigh Walton? It was late morning when the first hints of tragedy were uncovered. The Florida sun had begun its slow climb, burning away the early fog, but the woods remained shadowed and cool under the thick canopy. Birds moved silently above, as if even nature itself sensed the unease lurking below. A local hunter, familiar with the trails and hidden clearings of Lake County, had wandered deeper than usual that day. He followed the sound of running water, the soft crackle of dry leaves underfoot, and then a glimpse of something that didn't belong. At first, he thought it was discarded clothing, maybe a ragged tarp someone had left behind. But as he stepped closer, the outline became unmistakable. A human figure, partially obscured by the dense underbrush. Kneeling beside it, he felt the cold wash of dread that only comes when you know life has been stolen. The body was that of a young woman. Her clothing was tattered and worn, evidence that she had been there for some time. The heat of the Florida summer had accelerated decomposition, leaving the remains fragile, brittle. A jigsaw puzzle of bones, sinew, and lingering shadows of what once was. There was no wallet, no purse, no identification, nothing to suggest who she was or why she had ended up here, alone and lifeless, in the middle of a quiet forest. The hunter did the only thing he could. He called 911. Within minutes, the first responders arrived, flashing lights cutting through the trees like urgent signals in the wilderness. Detectives followed, cameras in hand, notebooks ready to capture every detail. Yet, even as they worked, the case presented a chilling truth. This was a murder that had left almost no trace. No witnesses, no obvious signs of struggle beyond the scene itself. Only questions. The medical examiner, a veteran of decades in the field, examined the remains on site. He noted subtle clues, injuries consistent with blunt force trauma, but much of the evidence had been eroded by time and the elements. The body's condition made it nearly impossible to determine even the most basic details, age, ethnicity, or physical characteristics, with certainty. Faced with these obstacles, investigators assigned her a placeholder name, Julie Doe, a name designed to humanize her in police records and media reports, a small gesture of respect for a life that had been violently taken. But it was ultimately a name built from absence, a shadow of the real person who had existed in the world before her death. For the detectives on the scene, the initial investigation was frustrating. The forest left behind few clues. The soil swallowed evidence. Insects and scavengers disturbed what little remained. Each step forward in the inquiry felt like reaching into darkness, fingers brushing only air. Rumors spread through the local community. Hikers whispered about the discovery, Neighbors speculated on the identity, but no one came forward with answers. The case became one more unsolved mystery in the files of Lake County, a story that would fade from headlines, yet linger like an unwelcome shadow in the minds of those who had worked the scene. And yet, beneath the surface of this chilling tableau, one fact remained. The woman's story was not over. Though her identity would remain a secret for decades, her DNA carried a message. A silent witness waiting, patient and persistent, for the day science would give her back her name. Because in every cold case, there is a thread, sometimes faint, sometimes nearly invisible, that, if followed, can eventually lead to truth. And in the case of Julie Doe, that thread would one day unravel the decades-long silence, revealing not just who she was, but raising the question that continues to haunt investigators today. Who ended her life in the shadows of that Florida forest? In 1988, the world did not notice her absence. Not really. To most, Julie Doe was just another case number. A young woman found dead in the Florida woods. Yet beneath the records, behind the official reports, was a story that went far deeper than a missing identity. She was transgender, a fact that, in the late 1980s, carried stigma and prejudice the justice system was ill-prepared to address. At the time, the media rarely covered cases involving transgender victims with care. Headlines were often dismissive or sensationalized. Terms that are considered disrespectful today were casually used then. And for law enforcement, a victim who did not fit societal norms often meant a case would receive less attention, fewer resources, and slower progress. For Julie Doe, this reality translated into decades of silence. Investigators struggled to find even the most basic leads. Missing persons reports offered no matches. Fingerprints didn't yield results. Dental records were inconclusive. And while forensic science had begun to advance, it was still rudimentary compared to the breakthroughs of the 21st century. DNA profiling existed, but databases were limited, and cross-referencing unidentified remains with distant relatives was impossible. So she remained nameless, forgotten, a phantom in the files of cold cases, tucked into a drawer, slowly fading from memory. Her anonymity had consequences beyond police reports. Families of missing transgender women often faced a similar erasure, their loved ones marginalized, overlooked, or misrepresented. And in Pamela's case, the lack of identification meant that her story, her life, and her death became one long question mark. Communities whispered about the case, but whispers do not solve murders. A few locals remembered the discovery vividly, recounting the chilling moment when a body had been uncovered in the woods. But none could provide the answers investigators desperately needed. The young woman's life was reduced to bones, leaves, and a name that was never truly hers. Even within law enforcement, a subtle but undeniable bias shaped the trajectory of the investigation. Cases involving transgender victims were often deprioritized. Officers and detectives, sometimes unconsciously, sometimes by systemic design, treated such deaths as complicated or less urgent. Resources went elsewhere, leaving Julie Doe in a quiet, unresolved limbo. And yet, despite the neglect, the question lingered. Someone somewhere had known her. Someone had loved her, argued with her, or even feared her. But those people were lost in the shadows, invisible against the backdrop of a society that was not ready to see her as she truly was. For decades, the world would see only the shell of a tragedy, a nameless victim, a case file. But beneath that, Pamela's story waited, waiting for a world equipped not only with the tools to identify her, but with the willingness to acknowledge her fully. Because the truth of who she was, her identity, her life, and the injustice of her murder could not remain hidden forever. And as the years stretched on, one thing became clear. Julie Doe was not forgotten by everyone. Somewhere in the shadows of science, in the meticulous records of forensic specialists, her story was quietly preserved. Her DNA, the silent witness, carried the promise of revelation, waiting patiently for the moment when the decades of neglect would finally be challenged by discovery. Pamela Leigh Walton was more than a name eventually restored in 2025. She was a person, full of hopes, fears, and the quiet resilience required to navigate a world that often refused to see her for who she truly was. But in 1988, no one knew her. To the outside world, she was only Julie Doe, a ghostly figure lying in the Florida woods. Yet beneath that nameless shell was a life that had been lived with courage, struggle, and a desire for belonging. Reconstructing her story is not easy. Records are scarce. Friends who knew her are difficult to trace. But what forensic genealogy and family interviews later revealed paints a portrait of a young transgender woman navigating the challenges of the 1980s. Pamela grew up in an era when being transgender was rarely discussed, rarely accepted, and often punished with ostracization or worse. She faced obstacles at every turn: discrimination in schools, limited employment opportunities, and the constant threat of violence. Yet she persisted, building a small network of friends who recognized her as Pamela, a woman with dreams and a sense of self that refused to be silenced. In the months leading up to her death, she moved through the world cautiously, aware that each interaction could carry risk. She frequented places where she felt relatively safe: the homes of friends, local LGBTQ+ community spots, and familiar neighborhoods where she could blend in. But even these safe spaces were fragile. The 1980s were a dangerous time for transgender women, especially in areas where visibility invited scrutiny. Investigators piecing together her life later discovered hints of her personality. She was determined, kind-hearted, and quietly defiant in the face of social judgment. Those who knew her spoke of a humor that could break tension, of a sharp mind navigating a society that often underestimated her. Yet there were also warnings: concerns about certain acquaintances, the constant need to be vigilant, and the underlying fear that her life could be at risk. It is impossible to know all the decisions Pamela made in her final days. Did she go out that evening hoping to meet a friend? Was she seeking refuge from conflict? Or was she simply trying to survive, as she had so often done? The record is silent. What is clear, however, is that she entered those Florida woods and never emerged alive. Her death was not only a violent end but a reflection of a world unprepared to protect her. For decades, she remained invisible to law enforcement, to society, and to history itself. Her life, vibrant and meaningful, was reduced to bones and a placeholder name. And yet, even in the face of such erasure, her story refused to die entirely. The DNA she carried, the silent record of who she was, waited patiently for the moment science would restore her name. The memories of friends and family, scattered and hidden for decades, kept the faintest glimmer of her existence alive. Pamela Leigh Walton was more than a victim. She was a woman who lived, loved, and existed with a strength that the world around her often failed to recognize. Her murder would erase her from the public eye, but her identity, her truth, and her story were preserved in ways that would eventually defy decades of neglect. And as we explore the investigation that followed her death, it becomes painfully clear: understanding Pamela's life is not just about piecing together a biography. It is about acknowledging a humanity that was denied for too long, a humanity that demands we remember her not just as Julie Doe, but as Pamela Leigh Walton. From the moment Pamela's body was discovered, detectives worked tirelessly, yet they quickly realized the case was unlike any they had encountered. The forest had swallowed most clues, and the few remnants left behind offered frustratingly little guidance. The initial investigation was painstaking. Officers canvassed the area, looking for anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual. Local residents were questioned repeatedly. Flyers were posted, but the deeper detectives dug, the fewer answers emerged. Witnesses were scarce. No one remembered seeing Pamela that day. No one had reported her missing. It was as if she had vanished into thin air, and then, tragically, into the forest. The crime scene itself offered limited evidence. The body showed signs of blunt force trauma, but decomposition and environmental damage made it nearly impossible to determine the weapon or the exact circumstances of the attack. Clothing and personal items were missing, leaving only skeletal fragments, broken fingernails, and faint traces of what may have been a struggle. Every lead seemed to dissolve the moment investigators thought they had grasped it. Even forensic science, which was steadily evolving in the late 1980s, had its limits. DNA profiling was in its infancy. Fingerprint databases were incomplete. The technology simply could not answer the questions investigators had, and the more time passed, the colder the trail became. Detectives considered every possible scenario. Was this a random act of violence? A targeted attack? A hate crime? They interviewed acquaintances, scoured missing persons reports, and tried to trace Pamela's last known movements, but the lack of identification made even the most basic connections impossible. Without a name, they were chasing shadows, and the societal context didn't help. Cases involving transgender women often received less attention, fewer resources, and slower responses. Investigators, while dedicated, were constrained by biases and systemic limitations. The case quietly slipped from the headlines and into the archives, where it would remain for decades. Yet within the silence, there were small sparks of hope. Fingerprints were preserved. Photographs of the remains were catalogued. Clothing fibers and traces of personal items were documented. Every detail, however minor, was saved in case future technology could reveal what human eyes could not. Despite these efforts, frustration mounted. Each new lead led to another dead end. Families of missing persons were contacted, but none recognized her. Rumors circulated in the community, but the truth remained elusive. The investigation stalled, leaving detectives haunted by the knowledge that someone had been brutally murdered, and her killer had walked away. As the years passed, Julie Doe's case became emblematic of a chilling reality. Some murders resist resolution not because they are unsolvable, but because society and technology were not yet ready to uncover the truth. The forest had given up its secrets that day, but the world was not yet ready to hear them. And yet, even in these long decades of silence, the case was not entirely forgotten. Among the dust-covered files and fading photographs, a seed of possibility remained. Forensic science was evolving. DNA technology was advancing. And somewhere, buried within the cells of Julie Doe's remains, the story of Pamela Leigh Walton waited, patient, silent, and persistent. The case would remain cold for decades, but the spark of truth, though faint, had not been extinguished. For decades, Julie Doe existed only in records, photographs, and the quiet recollections of those who had worked her case. The world moved on. Headlines faded. Other murders dominated the news cycle. And yet, the woman in the Florida woods remained nameless, forgotten by nearly everyone outside law enforcement files. The 1990s came and went. Law enforcement agencies modernized. New officers took over old cases, and technology slowly improved. But Julie Doe's mystery remained unsolved. The photographs of her remains, carefully stored, became part of cold case archives. Investigators occasionally revisited them, hoping a fresh perspective might reveal a clue missed the first time. But for 30-plus years, nothing surfaced. Her anonymity had consequences beyond the forensic realm. Families of missing persons, especially those of transgender individuals, often encountered similar erasure. Some searched tirelessly for loved ones, filing missing persons reports that never connected to unidentified victims like Julie Doe. Others lived with a gnawing fear that the person they loved had been lost, their absence never officially acknowledged. Within the law enforcement community, Julie Doe became emblematic of the challenges of cold cases. Detectives would speak of her in hushed tones, sharing the frustration of knowing someone had been murdered while their killer remained free. Each year that passed made the case colder, the trail more obscured, the possibility of resolution dimmer. Yet amid the silence, there was a quiet persistence. Small sparks of hope occasionally flickered. The preservation of evidence, photographs, and fingerprints meant that future breakthroughs were possible. Advocates for missing and murdered transgender persons began to raise awareness. Cold case units slowly adopted new technologies, hoping to solve the mysteries that had long evaded justice. Julie Doe's DNA, the silent witness to her identity, remained intact. It was a waiting thread, a key that could one day unlock decades of uncertainty. Scientists knew that advances in forensic science, particularly in DNA profiling and genealogy, could eventually bridge the gap between her remains and her true identity. Meanwhile, outside the labs and police archives, the human side of her story lingered in fragments. Old acquaintances, perhaps unaware of the full extent of her tragedy, remembered a kind, determined woman. Friends recalled her humor, her intelligence, her quiet strength in the face of a society that often refused to acknowledge her. Their memories, though scattered and incomplete, preserved the essence of Pamela Leigh Walton long before her name would ever return. Decades of silence are heavy. They distort perception, blur memory, and erode hope. But in the case of Julie Doe, silence did not mean disappearance. Her story, carefully preserved in bone, in DNA, and in the memories of those who knew her, waited for a world capable of seeing her fully, waited for technology capable of giving her back her name, waited for justice to begin its slow, painstaking march. And as the 21st century dawned, that long, patient silence would finally be challenged. Advances in forensic science, once unimaginable, began to breathe life into cold cases that had seemed hopeless. Julie Doe, nameless for 37 years, was on the cusp of revelation. But the world did not yet know it, because while the tools existed, they had not yet been applied to her case. And until they were, the killer walked free, and her story remained a haunting, unresolved echo through decades of quiet. By the 1990s, forensic science was beginning to change the landscape of criminal investigation. Fingerprints, once the cornerstone of identification, were now supplemented by the emerging power of DNA. Laboratories across the country were learning to extract genetic material from evidence that had once been considered unusable. Cold cases that had sat dormant for decades were now receiving new attention. Julie Doe's case remained among them. While the initial investigation had yielded little more than photographs and skeletal fragments, detectives recognized that her remains might hold secrets waiting for the right technology to uncover. Her DNA, carefully preserved, became a quiet beacon in the archives, a silent witness to her identity and potentially to the truth of her murder. During the 1990s and early 2000s, DNA databases expanded. The Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, allowed law enforcement agencies to compare genetic material from crime scenes with known offenders. But for Julie Doe, there was a critical limitation. Her killer's DNA was not in any database, and even her own identity could not yet be confirmed, leaving investigators grasping at fragments of information with no way to connect them. It was a frustrating era. Every technological advancement seemed tantalizingly close to unlocking the truth, yet just out of reach. Investigators re-examined old evidence: fibers, fingerprints, and teeth. Photographs of her remains were scrutinized under brighter lights, higher resolutions, and with new forensic techniques. Still, the case resisted resolution. The real breakthrough would not come from standard forensic methods alone. It came from an unexpected frontier: genetic genealogy. By the 2010s, investigators had begun collaborating with genealogists, people trained not just to read family trees, but to reconstruct them from DNA. Through distant relatives and careful analysis, genetic connections could be traced across decades, revealing identities that had been lost to time. Cold cases that had seemed hopeless were suddenly solvable. Julie Doe's DNA was a perfect candidate. Stored carefully for decades, it carried the blueprint of her life. The sequences of her genes held information that, in the hands of skilled genealogists, could link her to living relatives, uncovering the identity that had been stripped from her body for nearly 4 decades. Meanwhile, society itself had changed. Awareness of the struggles faced by transgender individuals had increased. Media and law enforcement were slowly beginning to treat cases involving transgender victims with the seriousness and respect that had been absent in the 1980s. The combination of technology and societal change meant that Julie Doe's story, long overlooked, was finally on the verge of being told fully. The pieces were finally aligning. Preserved DNA, forensic genealogy, and a growing commitment to justice for marginalized victims. It was only a matter of time before the decades of silence would be broken. Yet even with these advances, investigators faced one chilling truth: the longer a case remains cold, the more fragile the trail becomes. Memories fade, witnesses pass away, evidence degrades. And for Pamela Leigh Walton, the years spent as Julie Doe made finding her killer all the more urgent, because every moment that passed allowed them to remain free, while her story waited silently to be uncovered. But the patient thread of DNA, the silent witness that had survived the passage of decades, was about to give voice to a woman who had been nameless for far too long. And when it did, the world would finally see Pamela Leigh Walton, not as a ghost, not as a mystery, but as a real person whose life mattered. Decades had passed, but Julie Doe had not been forgotten. Her skeletal remains, preserved in a quiet corner of the forensic lab, carried a secret that no one could yet see. The breakthrough came not from a sudden tip or eyewitness, but from the steady march of science, the evolution of forensic genealogy. In the early 2020s, Florida authorities made the decision to re-examine her case using advanced DNA technology. A small team of cold case detectives and forensic specialists carefully extracted a sample of her DNA, sending it to a lab specializing in genetic genealogy. It was meticulous work, requiring precision and patience. Every fragment mattered, every sequence could hold a clue. Weeks turned into months as genealogists built family trees, analyzed distant relatives, and cross-referenced genetic markers. The process was painstaking. Each lead had to be verified, each connection painstakingly documented. A single mistake could send them down a false path, wasting precious time. And then, finally, there it was, a match. A distant cousin in a public genealogy database carried DNA that aligned with Julie Doe's profile. From this single connection, investigators began reconstructing her family tree, tracing lines across generations, states, and decades. Each step confirmed what they were beginning to suspect. Julie Doe was not nameless after all. On a quiet morning in 2025, the verification came through. The woman who had lain unidentified for 37 years had a name: Pamela Leigh Walton. For detectives who had worked the case in its earliest days, it was a profound moment. The mystery that had haunted them for decades was suddenly tangible. For Pamela's family, who had long suspected she had been lost to violence, it was both a relief and a heartbreak. They finally knew who she was, but they were confronted once more with the knowledge of how she had died. The news was met with emotion, tears, disbelief, and a long overdue acknowledgement of a life that had been reduced to a placeholder name for too long. Media outlets reported the breakthrough, emphasizing not only the power of modern science, but the tragic reality that her killer had never been found. Pamela's identification marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. She was no longer Julie Doe in files or photographs. She was a real person, someone who had lived, laughed, and faced challenges with courage. Her name restored, she reclaimed her place in history, and her story could finally be told as it should have been from the beginning. But the joy of discovery was tempered by a chilling truth. The person responsible for her death remained unidentified. Investigators now had a name, but the question that had haunted her for decades persisted. Who killed Pamela Leigh Walton? Even as the world learned her identity, the case remained open. Modern forensic techniques allowed detectives to re-examine old evidence, hoping that the same DNA that revealed her name might one day reveal her killer. Tips from the public were encouraged, and cold case units continued their meticulous work. Yet, the passage of time made the task formidable. Memories had faded. Witnesses had passed away. Opportunities for connection had been lost. Still, hope endured. The breakthrough demonstrated that even the coldest of cases could be solved with persistence, science, and a refusal to let victims remain forgotten. Pamela's story was proof that names matter, that identities matter, and that even decades later, justice can begin its long journey. Pamela Leigh Walton was no longer a ghost. She was real. She was remembered. And her story, though tragic, would now serve as a testament to the power of perseverance, the advances of science, and the importance of giving a voice to those who had long been silenced. With her name restored, Pamela Leigh Walton was no longer a shadow in the files. She became a real person once more, someone whose life, struggles, and dreams could be remembered and honored. For her family, the revelation brought both relief and grief. relief that they finally knew who she was, grief for the decades lost and the life cut tragically short. Interviews with relatives painted a portrait of a woman full of determination and quiet strength. Pamela had grown up navigating a world that often misunderstood her. As a transgender woman in the 1980s, she faced challenges that were both overt and subtle: discrimination at school, exclusion from workplaces, and the constant need for vigilance in public spaces. Yet those who knew her spoke of resilience, kindness, and an intelligence that shone even under pressure. Friends remembered her warmth, her humor, and her courage. She was someone who would quietly support those around her, yet also protect herself with sharp intuition. Her life, though brief, was full of moments of connection, laughter, and perseverance. Through the painstaking work of genealogists and investigators, small fragments of Pamela's story emerged. She had ambitions and dreams, though the world she lived in made them difficult to realize fully. She had loved and been loved, forming bonds that were severed too soon by her murder. And while her life ended tragically, the restoration of her name allowed those who survived her to acknowledge her fully, without the shadow of anonymity that had hung over her for decades. Her story became a symbol of dignity restored. For decades, Julie Doe had been a placeholder, a faceless victim in the eyes of society. Now, with Pamela's identity reclaimed, she became a person whose existence mattered, whose life could be told, and whose memory could demand justice. Her family, once haunted by uncertainty, were able to mourn openly. They spoke publicly about her life, the challenges she faced, and the woman she had been. They emphasized the importance of remembering her as more than a victim, as Pamela Leigh Walton, a woman who deserved to be seen, named, and honored. The restoration of her identity also resonated beyond her family. Advocacy groups for transgender individuals and families of missing persons saw in Pamela's case a powerful example of why every victim deserves recognition. Her story highlighted the crucial role of forensic science in restoring identity and dignity, even decades after a crime. Yet amidst the celebration of her name, there remained a chilling truth. While Pamela's identity had been recovered, the person who ended her life was still unknown. The search for justice continued, a grim reminder that solving a cold case is never only about names. It is also about accountability, and ensuring that those responsible for violence are held to account. Pamela Leigh Walton's story, once hidden in the shadows, had finally come to light. Her name returned, her life acknowledged, and her humanity restored. And though the mystery of her murder remained, she would never again be forgotten. In remembering Pamela, we honor more than her life. We honor the principle that no person should remain nameless, no life should be invisible, and no tragedy should fade silently into history. Even with Pamela Leigh Walton's name restored, the most haunting question remains unanswered. Who killed her? Investigators now had her identity, but they faced the same grim reality that had haunted the case for decades. The crime had occurred in 1988, in a remote forested area, leaving little physical evidence behind. Witnesses from the time were few, and memories had faded. Potential suspects had moved, passed away, or disappeared entirely. Every lead was now entangled in the passage of time. Modern forensic techniques provided hope. DNA evidence, preserved meticulously since the initial discovery, could now be reanalyzed with advanced technology. Investigators revisited fingerprints, fibers, and trace evidence that were once considered inconclusive. Digital databases allowed for broader searches, connecting patterns across jurisdictions. But even with these tools, the trail to her killer remained frustratingly cold. The reality of cold cases is harsh. Time erodes evidence, and the longer a crime remains unsolved, the greater the chance that the perpetrator walks free. Yet detectives remain determined, knowing that breakthroughs are possible even decades later. Every clue, no matter how small, could eventually connect the dots. In Pamela's case, investigators explored every angle: acquaintances from her life, local records, and possible links to similar crimes. Theories were considered and discarded, suspects questioned and cleared. Each dead end brought frustration, but the team refused to give up. Her story deserved more than silence. Her killer deserved accountability. Advocates and family members have amplified the call for justice. Media coverage following her identification renewed public interest, encouraging anyone with information to come forward. Tips from the community, combined with forensic advances, have reopened doors that were long thought closed. Yet, the passage of nearly 4 decades makes the pursuit of justice more complex. Memories fade, witnesses die, locations change. The very environment where the crime occurred, once a remote stretch of Florida forest, has been altered, with development, logging, and natural decay potentially destroying critical clues. Still, hope endures. Cold case detectives know that some crimes, no matter how old, can be solved with persistence, collaboration, and cutting-edge science. The story of Pamela Leigh Walton demonstrates both the resilience of truth and the haunting reality of unresolved murder. For Pamela's family, the identification brought relief but also renewed urgency. They are no longer haunted by the uncertainty of who she was, but by the continued absence of justice. They, along with investigators and advocates, remain determined to ensure her killer is finally held accountable. Her case serves as a stark reminder. Solving a murder is never just about identification. It is about holding those responsible to account, no matter how much time has passed. And until her killer is found, Pamela's story, though her name restored, remains unfinished. The decades-long silence surrounding her murder has been broken, but the shadows that cover the identity of her killer remain deep and unresolved. Yet, the journey to justice is ongoing, and her story continues to push forward, demanding answers that, even now, could finally emerge from the darkness. Pamela Leigh Walton's story is more than a cold case solved by science. It is a testament to the enduring power of truth, the resilience of memory, and the importance of recognizing lives that society often overlooks. Her life, once reduced to a placeholder name, Julie Doe, now serves as a reminder that every individual deserves acknowledgement, respect, and remembrance. The decades she spent in anonymity reveal the harsh reality faced by many transgender victims. Lives rendered invisible, cases deprioritized, and voices silenced. Yet her story also demonstrates the remarkable capabilities of modern forensic science. Genetic genealogy, DNA analysis, and meticulous record-keeping transformed an unresolved mystery into a humanized narrative. What was once a skeletal remnant in a forest became Pamela Leigh Walton, a woman with a name, a history, and a family who could finally mourn her fully. Her identification inspired advocates, families of missing persons, and law enforcement alike. It proved that patience and innovation could bridge decades of silence, restoring dignity to those who were lost and forgotten. It reminded society that every cold case matters, and that marginalized victims deserve justice as urgently as anyone else. Pamela's life, though tragically brief, leaves a legacy that extends beyond her family. Her story encourages systemic change, better recognition of transgender victims, more equitable allocation of investigative resources, and continued advancement in forensic science to solve cases once thought impossible. Each lesson learned from her case strengthens the capacity of law enforcement and society to respond with compassion, diligence, and justice. Yet the story is not fully complete. The person who took Pamela's life remains unidentified. The pursuit of justice continues, a stark reminder that solving a murder is not merely about uncovering identity. It is about accountability, closure, and the promise that no one will be forgotten. In remembering Pamela, we honor her life, recognize her struggles, and recommit to the principles that she, and victims like her, deserve: dignity, respect, and justice. Her story is both a warning and a beacon, a warning of the consequences of neglect and bias, and a beacon of hope for what can be achieved when science, determination, and humanity converge. Pamela Leigh Walton may have been silenced by violence, but she cannot be erased. Her name restored, her story told. She now stands as a symbol of resilience, the enduring search for justice, and the importance of remembering those who society once chose to overlook. The lessons of her life and death extend beyond one forest, one crime scene, or one cold case file. They reach into every community, challenging us to see, to act, and to honor the lives of those who cannot speak for themselves. And in remembering her, we ensure that Pamela Leigh Walton will never be forgotten again. If Pamela Leigh Walton's story moved you, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more in-depth true crime investigations. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new case unraveling the darkest mysteries, cold cases, and stories that demand justice. Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Pamela's killer will ever be found? Every tip, every discussion, helps keep the memory of victims like her alive. And remember, justice may be delayed, but the truth will always find a way.